All right, here we go. We've got tangent of x plus cotangent of x divided by secant of x squared. And I want you to really understand that with these problems where you're simplifying your trig identities or proving that there's not just one way to do this. This is something you need to kind of just wrestle around with, honestly be able to just play with, and we'll go from there. There's not just one way, so I'll show you a couple different ways on this, and there's many more, I'm sure. But just understanding what these different terms mean and how you can kind of use them to help you out in that case. So let's get started. Tangent of x, let's go ahead and just rewrite that. Tangent of x, but plus cotangent of x. Well, what is cotangent of x? It's 1 over tangent of x. Now that whole thing is then being divided by secant squared of x, or secant x squared. And so now we've got tangent up at the top, but they don't have the same denominator. So what can we do? Well, let's multiply the tangent by, no, where'd the pen go? By tangent of x over tangent of x. So that's really just 1. But this will give us a common denominator so that we can add these two terms together. All right, so we end up with tangent of x squared over tangent of x plus 1 over tangent of x, still all divided by secant of x squared. Okay, now that we have a common denominator, we can add these two terms together. So we have tangent of x squared plus 1 over tangent of x. And then big denominator here divided by, so that whole term there is being divided by secant of x squared. All right, come on back to the beginning here, and we'll keep on working. So tangent squared of x plus 1. What is that equal to? And so remember we have sine of x squared plus cosine of x squared equals 1. How could we get tangent squared out of this? Okay, well, tangent squared would be sine divided by cosine. So we're going to divide everything here by cosine squared. Now, sine squared divided by cosine squared, that's tangent squared of x. Cosine divided by cosine, or cosine squared divided by cosine is 1. And 1 divided by cosine, remember that's secant. So secant squared x. So we just kind of proved the identity that we're going to need to use. We know what tangent squared of x plus 1 is. It is secant squared of x. So our next line, this is just kind of work we'll do on the side to use our identity. But our next line, we're substituting out tangent squared of x plus 1 as secant squared of x. So secant squared of x divided by tangent of x, and then divided by, big division line there, of secant squared of x. Secant of x squared. Now these compound fractions can be pretty difficult, and so this whole thing is being divided by secant squared of x. What if we multiplied by the reciprocal? So the reciprocal of secant squared of x squared is 1 over secant of x squared. Now when we multiply this fraction, so this part is now up there, so we kind of ignore that for a moment. We just switched it from division into multiplication of the reciprocal. Now when we multiply this out, well, what's secant of x squared divided by secant of x squared? Well, that's 1. And so we end up with 1 over tangent of x. What is 1 over tangent of x? Well, that is cotangent of x. And so we've simplified down our original expression here, down all the way to just cotangent of x. And there's one approach for you. Another one is going to be, well, let's see, we started with tangent of x. So this is a different approach to that same problem. Tangent of x plus cotangent of x. all over secant of x squared. And one thing that if you're having difficulties with these expressions and identities and the proving of the identities is to change everything to sine and cosine. They can kind of open up a little bit, and sometimes pieces just kind of fall into place when you do that. And so what I'm going to do is rewrite this as all sine and cosine. So tangent, well, that's going to be sine of x over cosine of x, plus cotangent, that's cosine of x over sine of x. And then again, big division line, secant squared, that's going to be 1 over cosine of x squared. All right, and like we did before, we don't really want to deal with these reciprocals, or these double compounded fractions, so let's multiply instead by the reciprocal. So this is going to be times cosine squared of x over 1, multiplying by the reciprocal. So this is gone because we've now used it up over here. And that's going to give us, and we'll actually rewrite it down right over here. That'll give us sine of x cosine squared of x, or cosine of x squared, all over cosine of x, plus cosine of x times cosine squared of x. And so really this is 3 cosines all being multiplied together right there. So let's change that to cosine to the third. Cosine of x to the third. There's 3 of them now multiplied together over sine of x. All right, we're on track. This is coming together now. And so we've got these 2 fractions, but we need to have common denominators. So multiply the first one by sine over sine, sine of x over sine of x, and the second one by cosine of x over cosine of x. That way we'll have a common denominator of sine and cosine. So this will give us sine squared of x cosine squared of x over sine x cosine x, plus cosine now to the fourth, cosine of x to the fourth over sine x cosine x. Okay, keep on going, and we've got, now we can add these together. And we've got sine of x squared cosine of x squared plus cosine to the fourth of x to the fourth, all over sine of x cosine of x. All right, and now we're going to use this just like we would if we happen to have a problem that said x squared y squared plus y to the fourth. Well, what could we factor out of all that? Well, we could factor out a y squared, right? And we would be left with x squared plus y squared. And that's exactly what we're going to do right here. We're going to factor out a cosine squared from each of them. So factor out a cosine squared. So we've got cosine squared, cosine of x squared, times what's still left inside was going to be sine of x squared plus cosine of x squared. And hopefully that right there triggers something for you. Hopefully that triggers something for you. Divided by sine of x cosine x. Okay. Well, what is sine squared x, sine of x squared plus cosine of x squared? Well, that's 1. That was one of our identities. So we can substitute this whole piece out and put 1 in its place. So we're really left with cosine of x squared over sine of x cosine x. Cosine of x divided by cosine of x is 1, and so we're left with just 1 cosine of x still up in the numerator because this was squared. And what is cosine of x divided by sine of x? Well, that once again is our cotangent of x, just like we had back over here going this way. So this process was a little bit more lengthy, the second one here. But if you're not really comfortable with having all those different trig identities memorized, realize that you can always change everything to sine and cosine and still work your way through the problem. So we'll leave these next few ones up for you to work through. Try them before watching any more of the videos, and we'll keep on working on it over the next little bit. All right, hope that helped.